If your loved one goes missing or worse, becomes a crime victim and police hit a dead end, what do you do to solve the mystery? Just how far would you go? Would you seek out a psychic? Tonight, incredible stories of psychics who crack cases and solve crimes when police give up. Like most lawyers, when I try cases, I want the cold, hard facts. And if you're like most of us, you're skeptical about psychics. But when police hit a dead end, when the trail goes cold, they turn to psychic detectives. The results? Incredible. One of them, Peggy Goebel's sister, raped and bludgeoned to death in 1987. When police were stumped, psychic Nancy Weber helped them catch a killer. Welcome, ladies. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
First of all, I want to go straight to our so-called psychic, Nancy Weber. When did you first believe or realize that you're a psychic?
I didn't use that term as a child. I didn't know. I knew it as an adult when I worked in an acute psychiatric unit in the South Bronx.
As a nurse?
As a nurse. I ran the unit, and it was a wonderful group.
You were
that
a
let me
nurse
do it.
that ran a unit?
In acute crisis intervention for psychotic breaks.
You know, Nancy, so many people... Have you ever read Harry Potter?
I love Harry Potter.
I love Harry Potter. Do you remember the teacher in Harry Potter that teaches how to cast spells and read the future? She's woo,
Yes.
crazy.
Right.
That's what I think of when I think of a psychic. When you walked in a business suit, I nearly fell over.
Well, that's what I used to think psychics were, and that's why I was terrified of it. And I didn't want to be part of that world, so I never labeled it. When I worked as a young nurse, before I got into psychiatric nursing, the doctors were wonderful to me. So if I had a patient medical unit brought in, and they were rolled in, and the doctor's writing orders, and a doctor writes a diagnosis of congestive heart failure, and I go, I'm 19 years old, and I look at him, and I go, wrong orders. And he goes, what? I said, he doesn't have congestive heart failure. Do an upper GI. He's got a hiatal hernia. And he goes, really? And I go, absolutely. And he goes, okay. Orders it, comes back, and he goes, thanks. And he goes, how did you know? I said, you don't see it?
Now, you said that you grew up just thinking everybody else felt and saw the same thing.
There's no way a child knows that you're different. If you're deaf when you're a child, you don't know the other people can hear. When you can see things others cannot see, you don't know others cannot see it. How would you know? The only way I knew it...
What was your first experience that you can recall? Like most people, you ask them, what's the first thing you remember? And they remember, you know, the Christmas tree or trick-or-treating. You probably remember a psychic vision.
You're psychic yourself, because you know that.
What's the first thing?
The first thing I recall, I was about 2.5 years old. My mother had a friend visiting her, and I looked at her, and I saw in her belly a little thing. I didn't know what it was, and this voice said to me, it's a baby. And I went, baby? And the woman looked at my mother and said, I haven't told my husband yet. How does she know? And I never forgot that, because my mother's response to that was, go in your room.
Oh.
And I thought, but it's a baby.
Well, lucky for the rest of us, you didn't stop your career right then and there at, what, age 3 or 4?
Thank you, Nancy.
Then what happened?
I continued blurting out things for quite a while. Everyone backed away every so often, but I would blurt out. And I saw death a lot. And when I saw Sixth Sense, I identified with him very much, the little boy, other than he had a mom who understood. And my mom was very frightened of it. My father didn't say anything about it. And when my sister was pregnant with her second child, I must have been about 15. That was the last incident. When I looked at her, I woke up in the morning, ran to see my sister and my brother-in-law, and I said, you're going to give birth tomorrow. That was Monday morning. At 2:56 p.m. to a 7-pound, 11.5-pound boy. And they said, oh, good, because they believed me. And she went to the doctor that day and came home. She said, you're wrong. I've got weeks to go. And so Tuesday morning, her water broke, and she rushed to the hospital.
256.
And the only thing I
7-pound
heard
baby
was that
boy.
the doctor ran out and said, burn your sister at the stake. She's a witch. So do you think you'd rush in and do all this?
Yeah.
I went into nursing. It was nice and practical and grounding and safe. And I am so grateful I became a nurse first.
Here on the set with me is Peggy Goebel. Peggy is a crime victim. Her sister was raped and bludgeoned to death back in 1987. This is a shot of the victim, Elizabeth Cornish. She was just 42 years old, in the prime of her life. And catch this, Elizabeth had 5 kids left behind after her death. Welcome.
Thank you.
How did you hook up with Nancy?
I had my own house cleaning business back then, and one of the ladies that I cleaned for, her name was Gloria, gave me Nancy's name. Nancy, you lived in Flanders at that time, and I called her up, set up an appointment. And
But why?
to help, because after my sister was murdered, they didn't know who murdered her. We were all scared. My family, my nieces, we were all scared to death.
What were the facts surrounding Elizabeth's disappearance? Well, her murder, because they found her fairly quickly, right?
Well, she was killed anywhere between 11 and 2 in the morning, and they didn't find her till her boyfriend found her the next day.
Right.
In the evening.
So the mystery was not where is she, what became of her.
What became
Instead,
of
the
her.
mystery was who killed her.
Absolutely.
Was this before DNA?
Before DNA.
Right.
Yes.
I thought so, because I was trying cases in '87, and DNA was not advanced to the point where it was being used in rape cases.
Right.
She was raped and bludgeoned to death.
Yes, she was.
And that DNA would have easily matched up to the defendant, but it didn't exist then.
No, it didn't.
So why were police stumped? Normally they start with the husband, the boyfriend, the
Well, that's what they
grocery
did.
boy. What happened?
That's what they did, but it seemed like forever. You know what I mean? It just, every day would go by. Did they catch him yet? I would call every day. Did they get him yet? Did they get him yet? Did they get him yet? So, that's why I went to Nancy, and she was just so helpful to me. And she helped solve the crime.
What did police think when you told them you were going to seek out a psychic detective?
Well, they knew Nancy, so they were very pleased with it.
Had you worked with the police before?
5 years before, the same police officers and prosecutor's office in Warren County on a still unsolved till today case.
Wow. So they thought she had a good reputation.
Absolutely.
When you told cops you were calling her, they went along.
Absolutely, yes.
How soon after contacting Nancy Weber was the case solved?
I don't even remember.
Do you remember?
I don't recall.
Hold on, I'll
Days.
give you a
Days.
couple of days. I'm going to give you a moment to
About a
percolate.
week.
Tonight, unsolved crimes, missing people. When the case goes cold, no leads, no witnesses, no fingerprints, no DNA. Where do you go? What do you do? Well, there is sometimes a last resort, so-called psychic detectives. Are they working miracles or just plain frauds? Welcome back to Nancy Grace. Let's go straight to a so-called psychic detective here in the studio with me. Not only Peggy Goebel, a crime victim who lost her sister many years ago at the hands of a murderer, and psychic Nancy Weber. Nancy, back to that time, back to 1987, when Peggy first contacted you, what do you do first?
She came to me. I didn't know what she was coming about. I tell people, don't tell me. I sat opposite her and I felt overwhelmed by horrible feelings and grief. So the first thing I did was say to her that I felt that there was a tragedy in her family, recent loss, and it happened in a horrible way. And Peggy started crying, and we spoke. I don't remember the words I said to her or the words she said, but I talked about the idea that the suspect, chief suspect, would be her boyfriend, but he was not guilty. And that I could not tell her anything else about
The chief suspect would be victim Elizabeth's boyfriend?
Yes.
Okay.
And that
Was he the chief suspect at the time?
Yes.
That's not unusual. Police normally look at husband, boyfriend, lover.
Right.
Right. And I told her that I could not tell her anything about the case itself. That if she would please go back and speak to whoever is working the case and I will give her police references and names for them to call and verify who I am, because I didn't know who it would be, and that I would be happy to help out. And I got a call immediately, I think the next day, from then Captain David Heater out of the prosecutor's office. And I recognized the voice and the name from 5 years before, when I worked on a case of an unsolved murder.
And then what happened?
And he asked me if I would come out, and I went to the crime scene. It was still a crime scene. And as I walked in, it was a first-floor apartment, and at the landing to the first floor, I looked up the staircase, and I said, the murderer lives upstairs. And he looked at me, and he said, well, there's a 19-year-old. I said, no, it's not him. There's an adult male.
Wait. You walked in to the building.
The apartment building, the landing, and I saw up the stairs a sense of a murderer. I didn't see anything. I saw energy that told me it's the murderer up there. And then I got a vision as I walked into Elizabeth's living room, where I saw 5'10", reddish-brown hair, scar on his right cheek, Western belt buckle. And I went to the bedroom. I didn't tell them at the time. Went to the bedroom where she was murdered. And I described the rape and the murder in details. And they looked at me, and true to how sometimes they would speak, they'd say, confirm. Confirm, confirm. I said, okay, let's go back to headquarters and talk. So we went back, and I went over what I felt was the murderer. And I said, he killed her probably around 3 a.m. or so. And they said, no, she was killed around 11. I said, no, she was killed around 3. And they looked at me and said, well, there's a man living upstairs. I said, first name John? They said, yes. I said, last name begins with the letter R, single syllable. They said, Reese is his last name. I said, that's him. And they looked at me and said, do you remember speaking about him before? I said, no, but he's a serial murderer, and he's tried to kill before, and he's killed before. And
now what she could not possibly know at the time is that Reese passed a polygraph.
He did, yes, he
passed a polygraph, right. But you believed he was the killer.
No,
and listen,
right.
I'm a great believer in polygraphs. Okay, go ahead.
And they were too, because they had the expert in our state, Jerry Lewis, who had never made a mistake. And he was wonderful. And they said, but he passed a polygraph.
But let me guess. Based on the incorrect time of death, they asked the wrong questions, so he could give a truthful answer and pass the polygraph.
Exactly. Exactly. And then Dave or somebody else looked at me and said, well, you're describing him again for the second time in 5 years. I said, well, he is. And I said, but it's him. And they said, well, he doesn't have a scar. He doesn't wear a Western belt buckle. And I looked at them and I said, you're blind. Go back and look. I said, and if he does, then think about what I just said, please. So they went back and looked and saw the scar and saw the Western belt buckle. And then the autopsy report came back. It was about 10 days after death. And it showed she died, I think, at 3:15 a.m. And they looked at each other.
And of course, they determined that by the last meal or the degree of morbidity in the limbs.
Exactly. And so Dave Heater and Sergeant Tom Trainer from the State Police decided to bring him back in. And they brought him back in, they videoed it. They had no evidence. I told them that there would be a hammer that she was killed with and that it would be in a swamp. I drew where the swamp was. They went and found a hammer with blood on it. It wasn't her blood. Nobody ever did anything to find out if it matched anything else.
But they found the hammer.
And he lived upstairs.
Did he ever confess?
Fully. On video.
Okay, just taking a psychic's word of her own abilities, if I did that, I would not be a good trial lawyer.
Right.
Let's corroborate, trust, but confirm. True?
True.
Had you ever used a psychic before?
Never.
Did you even believe in psychics before?
Somewhat.
If you're like me, I really don't know what to believe. Because as a trial lawyer, I knew that evidence would not come into trial anyway, so I never concerned myself with it. But thank God in this case, Peggy Goebel did concern herself with seeking out a psychic, and the murder case of her sister, Elizabeth Cornish, was solved. Stay with us for more incredible stories. Welcome back to Nancy Grace. Thank you for being with us tonight. Listen, I know it's a tough pill to swallow that psychics really existed. In all the years I tried cases, I never once put a psychic on the stand, didn't even consider it. But if you don't believe the ladies I've already introduced to you, crime victim Peggy Goebel, whose sister was bludgeoned to death after a sexual assault, and the psychic Nancy Weber that cracked the case, maybe you'll listen to a retired detective sergeant from Morris County, New Jersey. Joining me now, retired Detective Sergeant Lou Masterbone. Thank you for being with us, sir.
Thank you for having me, ma'am. It's an honor.
You know what? I think I, along with a lot of other Americans, have a hard time believing psychics are the real deal. What about you?
I didn't believe in them at all.
What changed your mind?
We found 3 kids in Honolulu, Hawaii.
And where? Hold on. Okay, what?
We found 3 children from a missing parental abduction case in Honolulu, Hawaii.
What happened? Now, is this the case you worked with Nancy Weber?
Yes, it is.
From the beginning, what happened?
Well, the mother called me and said, would I go to a psychic? And I was very skeptical about it because I didn't believe in them. And I said, well, we've done everything else. We have to do this. So I called a couple friends of mine who were police officers who had used her before. And they gave me the green light and said, yes, they would recommend her. So the mother and I went up to the house and went upstairs. And I'm saying, what am I doing here? And we walked into this room and...
Now, wait a minute. You said the mother and you, was Nancy Weber with you?
Yes. Well,
okay.
We went to Nancy's house.
Oh, okay, okay.
I'm sorry. We went to Nancy's house, and she took us upstairs. We sat on a couch, and she brought the children's shoes and a piece of, and some photographs and some clothing. And we just sat there and talked and talked.
Hey, you know what, Detective? That must have been heartbreaking for the mom to be holding her kids' clothing and shoes, and you're to a point where you have to seek out a psychic. You know, it's your last resort. You're hanging on to a thread there when you hand over a shoe to a psychic.
Absolutely. I mean, we went everywhere. There's nothing left to do.
So then what happened?
So we started talking, and I'm really skeptical of this whole thing. And then she started talking about that she says, I see him in Ulysses, Texas. And I looked at her and I said,
Ulysses, Texas? I've never even... Look, I'm from Macon, Georgia, and I have not heard of Ulysses, Texas.
Well,
go ahead.
Well, we were following the kids' school records, okay, and it stopped in Ulysses, Texas, and I almost fell out of the chair.
When she nailed Ulysses, Texas, okay.
I fell right out of the chair, and then she said to me, from there they went to California, and it starts with an R. And I said, Nancy, you know, California's a big state. I'm sure there's many cities with R's. And I asked her 3 or 4 times. She was getting aggravated at me at that time.
Yeah, I've already picked up she's got a little mean streak. Okay, go ahead.
Little bit, not big. So the dog came in, and just so happened the dog's name was Ramona. It was weird. The dog sat on her lap, on her feet, and she says, Ramona, California.
Had you ever met the dog?
I had a dog named Ramona, and she was sleeping.
Your dog came
right, and he kept asking me, what town, what town? I gave him the name of a street, East Street. No, didn't even get that. And it was about 3 or 4 hours. East Street began with an E, the letter E. And I could see water and sand. And about 4 hours into this, I'm like, would they all leave? And he asks me one more time, and Ramona looks up at me, and I go, Ramona, thinking she needed something. And he goes, Ramona? Ramona, California? And I look at her, and I look at him, and I said, right, Ramona, California.
What happened then, Detective?
Well, the next morning I got on the phone, and I called the San Diego Police Department, Sheriff's Department, and they did nothing. I believe the mother called, and then I called again, and they went over, and they went out and they found his house, 1225 East Street. And it was just so happens they talked to a neighbor, and the neighbor gave him a forwarding address to them for Honolulu, Hawaii. I almost fell on the floor. And with that, I went to Judge Shelton, one of our judges in the Morris County Courthouse, who's a wonderful human being. And he knew about this case in the beginning. And I said, Judge, I need a warrant to extradite for Hawaii.
And it's all based on a psychic.
Yes, ma'am.
How did the judge react to that surprise?
He was a little shocked. He looked at me and said, are you sure, Louis? I said, Your Honor, I got the address in Honolulu. With that, he wrote out the warrant. And I called out to Hawaii and spoke to Angel Yoramato. I'll never forget the man's name. And he said, you will extradite. And I said, yes, sir, I will. And we quipped him over the warrant.
Did you get the kids back?
Yes, ma'am. I was.
Wow. Detective Masterbone, don't move. You remind me of every homicide detective and investigator I ever worked with. Every good thing about them. Don't you move. If you're like most of us, you may be skeptical about psychics. Well, maybe tonight you'll change your mind. And listen, I don't have a dog in the fight, no skin in the game. But when you hear these stories, they will at least make you stop and wonder. Joining us now, two new guests, a family friend of a set of victims. Vashti Apostle Hurst is with us. She was to a point, she felt it was necessary to call on a psychic, Lori McQuarrie. Thank you for being with us, ladies. Let me quickly go to Vashti Apostle Hurst. Tell me what happened.
Thank you, Nancy, for addressing this important and critical topic. In the spring of 1992, Lila Failer and Alan Hernandez and their son Jonathan experienced the unimaginable tragedy of losing the other three children in the family and Lila's brother in a plane accident.
So the three kids and their uncle?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes. The uncle had flown in from California to visit the family, and the children had wanted to go up in the plane with him. And when they didn't return, obviously the panic started to set in, and they went through 10 grueling days with dozens of friends and hundreds of individuals, family, and people they didn't even know, the Flathead Indian tribe, police, helicopters, searchers, hikers, desperately trying to find the plane that went down in the treacherous mountains of St. Ignatius, Montana.
So the search ensued. No one could find the plane, the uncle, the three kids, and they just went up basically for a joyride, a sightseeing trip to have fun with the uncle who was the pilot, right?
That's right. And in these particular mountains, we were later told that there were downdrafts, and if you weren't familiar with that, it could be treacherous. And we ended up finding afterwards that he got caught in a downdraft and the plane flipped. And
but wait a minute. Are you telling me basically the whole family was gone? They had three kids and they were all gone.
They had 4 children, and their eldest son Jonathan was not there at the time.
So after the search ensued, Vashti, did people finally give up on the search?
You know, it was amazing how Lila and Alan and Jonathan survived this, and the local authorities gave up much sooner than they did. And the helicopter that was hired to go up was $500 an hour, so there was a constant need for friends and family, as well as this Indian tribe who was the first to donate $4,000 to get the helicopters up and actually sent members of their tribe to hike into these mountains.
So money became an issue and the search was starting to end. What prompted you to seek out a psychic?
Well, Lori McQuarrie has been doing this for years, and I commend her as being a pioneer in her field, because she has brought comfort to hundreds of people who have, tragically lost their loved ones. And we were all desperate to find these children. Of course, initially there was hope that they would survive. It was in the spring, but there were also the fears.
But how did you find Lori McQuarrie? What prompted you to finally seek out a psychic?
Because no one was having any success, and I knew that this family could not survive putting closure on whatever happened to the children if they weren't found without knowing what happened.
Okay.
And so I contacted Lori.
Let me go to Lori McQuarrie. She is joining us out of Portland. Lori, do you remember getting that call?
Oh, yes, I do.
What happened?
Well, what happened, of course, is that I got an immediate impression of where these children and their uncle might be, and being a mother myself, like any of us would, my compassion was at its height, and I wanted so badly. I wished I had lived closer. In fact, I was on my way at one point to go up there and physically help search, which I have done in many searches.
So you get the phone call, and then what happened?
Well, I talked to Stephen Thomas, who was one of the main searchers, and I had at that point been given a map of the area, and I marked it, told him where I thought that these children and their uncle might be, and as often happens, the people who were given the information said they've searched that area, they couldn't possibly be there because it was a box canyon. The pilot was too experienced to know to fly in there, and I have to stick to my guns, as most psychics will tell you. When we get our first impression, we know it's generally right. So they didn't go search that area immediately because the people who were in charge of the search decided that that area had been covered and there was no point in
when
it.
When you told them the area to go to, Lori, what prompted you to name that? Did you have a vision? Did you hear a voice? What told you to tell them to go there?
Yeah, I see it more just like a replay of a television set in my head.
What did you see?
And it's a knowing, it's a feeling. Well, I look at the map, and when I look at a map and I'm looking for a missing person, that area literally jumps out at me. And this was the St. Mary Lake area. And I told him immediately on the phone. I drew it on the map, and I said, this is where they're at, period.
What happened?
And like I said, even though that had been checked, I said, go back, you've missed them. And they didn't do it for several days, and when they finally went back, that's exactly where they found them.
Vashti, were you surprised when the family was found? Were they dead or alive?
What was amazing was I got a phone call, and they said, Vashti, they're calling off the search. And I said, they can't do that. Let me call Lori again, and I'll get right back to you. And I called Lori, and I said, they're going to call off the search. That can't happen, Lori. Where are they? And it was amazing. The specific instructions she gave me were exactly where the children were found. She said, Vashti, tell them to fly over St. Mary's Lake, and the pilot, the father was exhausted. The father and the son had been using this particular helicopter. The father was exhausted, and she said the father will probably be too tired to go. The son will go with a co-pilot, and as he turns, he will look left over his shoulder and see the sun gleaming off the wing of the plane, and that is exactly what happened. He went up. They didn't want to go up again. They went up. As he turned left, he saw the sun glinting on a Cessna plane. I believe it was white. It was upside down in the snow. The children and the uncle had died on impact and were still buckled in their seats. And what was amazing, when some of the Indians, hikers, went back up along with the family members, they said that it was remarkable that the snow was so pristine, that there were no animal tracks around the plane.
Story, as you are hearing from Lori McQuarrie and Vashti Hurst. The family was found. They died upon impact, but at least some closure was given to the children's parents. Welcome back. You may recognize the face and the voice of psychic Noreen Rainier. She became well known after the Scott Peterson trial, when Jackie Peterson hired Rainier to find Lacey Peterson. Unfortunately, the Peterson family didn't like what Noreen Rainier had to say. Also with me, Joe Uribe, agent in the Montana Division of Criminal Investigation, Noreen Rainier, psychic detective, and Janice Amatuzio, forensic pathologist from Minnesota. Joe Uribe, how did you get connected to Noreen Rainier? What happened in the case?
Well, I was involved in a case with a Montana State Workers' Compensation employment auditor. He was going to audit a business up in Shelby, Montana, and he disappeared right after meeting with the client up there. 8 days later, his body was found 9 miles out of Shelby. He was killed, put in his car, and pushed off a cliff. And we were called in initially in 1989 to do the investigation. And I actually became involved in it in 1994.
Wow. You got involved in 94, and what led you to Noreen Rainier?
Well, the case was well investigated by the local authorities and our previous agents that were down there. They did everything possible to try and find out what happened with Walter. They had a suspect, they had all the things, all the elements, but it didn't have enough to quite make the case. I had been involved in it, called back in to review the case, and when I did so, I thought the investigators did such a good job. I really didn't know what more we could do. And by a fluke, one night I wasn't feeling very good, and I went home and I turned on the TV and I happened to see a television program. In our particular case with our victim, he was murdered, put in the trunk of his state car and pushed over a cliff. Well, this program that I saw featured a psychic who solved a case about a man that was murdered, put in the trunk of a car and pushed over a cliff. And it just caught my attention. And I had to know more about this person.
And that person, Noreen Rainier?
That was Noreen Rainier. She was the psychic involved in that.
You contacted Noreen Rainier. What did she do?
Right. Well, I didn't believe in psychics. I never have believed in them. But as I said, this was so odd that I had to find out about it. So I called, actually it was Unsolved Mysteries. I called them and got a hold of Noreen through them. And I asked her for some people I could contact to see what references, if you will. And in checking references, I checked 6 different agencies, and they all highly recommended her, so I contacted her.
What happened?
And I ended up going down to Florida for a psychic consultation, I guess you call them. And what we did during our consultation was, the first thing I wanted her to do, because I had seen on one of these programs, to have possibly pick out a picture of our killer. And we brought some pictures along that weren't our suspect, and we put them all face down. And sure enough, she picked out the picture of the individual who was our prime suspect.
Joe,
yeah.
How many pictures did you show her?
I believe, well, there was, I think, 6 pictures face down on a table. And she picked out the one that I asked her which one do you think was our killer, and she picked out the right picture.
Now, question to you,
That got my attention.
Joe Uribe, it's almost like a card game. You put the pictures of your suspects, what did you say, 5 or 6 of them?
Yes.
Face down and ask her to pick the right one. Did you?
That's correct.
Did you give her any item belonging to the suspect to hold or consider?
She asked us to bring something from the victim. I brought a watch and a key from his state car. And as soon as she took hold of these items, she started seeing visions. And what we were going to do is try and ask her what happened. And we basically knew what had happened, but we wanted to see if she can confirm it.
Very quickly,
and she
Joe
immediately started having
Uribe,
visions.
very quickly, did you get the killer?
We did.
Wow.
She led us to information that only, I don't know how she knew these things.
Wow.
In fact, she was ribbing me because I wouldn't give her any information about the case, and she started laughing, and she said, well, I guess I'll have to tell you what happened. And she did. She literally told us about an ambush that took place. There were 3 people involved in the ambush. Our victim was beaten badly. He had a crescent wrench hit along the side of his head. She had a pain in her head during the consultation. And then she said, I was put down on my knees, and now I'm hurting in the back of my head. Well, our victim was in a position down on his knees, and he was shot in the back of the head.
Incredible.
The things she was saying was just incredible.
So you still don't believe in psychic detectives. Okay, we're going to a scientist, Janice Amatuzio out of Minnesota, a forensic pathologist. Tell me why you believe psychics can help a criminal investigation.
I think we don't always know everything yet. I think it's really important for us to keep an open mind. I always say to my investigators, make observations, not judgments. There's so many stories. There's so many cases that have been discussed. I think that sometimes we have to take the information, trust it, and confirm it, as the attorney said earlier today.
You know, Janice, it's so narrow to believe that we, as scientists or lawyers, know everything under the sun. I only knew I couldn't introduce it into evidence under the rules of evidence, but to have a narrow mind and not entertain the possibility of what could be, to me, is ridiculous.
It's true. You know, Albert Einstein wrote, the most beautiful thing we can experience is the mysterious. And he made some of the greatest discoveries on Earth. So I think it's really important for us to keep that open mind.
And Janice, what exactly do you do as a forensic pathologist?
I direct death investigation systems for 5 counties in Minnesota.
Okay, you know what? If you don't believe the psychic detectives, if you don't believe these veteran criminal investigators, homicide investigators, and now a forensic pathologist that believes psychic detectives can help in criminal cases, I give up. I rest my case tonight. I'm Nancy Grace signing off for tonight. Thank you to all of my guests. Aren't they fantastic? Thank you for being with us tonight and inviting us into your homes. Up next, the news from Headline Prime. But I'll see you tomorrow night, 8 sharp, here on Nancy Grace. And until then, good night, friend.